our learnings and insights for what has been a whirlwind 4 or 5 months with 19 of our businesses. To introduce myself briefly, I'm a social scientist and entrepreneur by background. I've been working with LSE Generate to design and launch the LSE's first accelerator program last year, and more recently, an advisor to the first ever Aspect Student Accelerator program across universities, and with our brilliant team that we have on the panel today. So if we just flip to the agenda, Will. So we have a fairly short time actually to run through a lot of the nuggets of wisdom that we've produced from this accelerator. So we'll start with a panel discussion with our team, Caroline and Kieran, if you can wave, and also Alejandro, one of the founders who was part of the cohort. So we'll do the first part, which is the panel discussion around learnings from the accelerator on the execution and running of the program. And then we'll have a short loo break, and that's going to be followed by a great guest speaker, Sharath Jeevan, who's an award-winning social entrepreneur and founder of Stir Education. So do stick around until 5:30. Before we get going, just a few bits of housekeeping. We will have some Q&A towards the end, and I'll pause a couple of times during. But if you have a burning question, please type it into the chat. And if we don't get to it through the actual panel, please do feel free to contact us after the event. If we go to the next slide. So we'll do intros and we'll do introductions in a second, but also I just wanted to say we are across all social media channels, so please do tweet us at Aspect Network through the event. And there are 2 reports that we're going to be sharing and talking about, which is the impact report and the social business model innovation report, which you should have all received last night when you registered for the event. So without further ado, just a few comments on the mission and why did we actually start and organize to launch the Aspect Accelerator. So go to the next slide. So our mission was really to equip social entrepreneurs with a socially impact business to effectively commercialize and grow their ventures. We chose 19 entrepreneurs who are tackling everything from supporting migrants on their journey towards financial freedom and to supporting student mental health, which Alejandro, who's the founder of I Speak Mental Health, will be talking about some of that today. So our founders had either a background in social sciences or they had multidisciplinary teams with business models and processes that were rooted in social science, or both. All were aligned to at least 2 UN SDGs. Well, if you want to go to the UN SDG slide. So this is actually just a map of all of the UN SDGs that our founders covered. And over the course of 3 months, they went through a very rigorous program with Caroline and Kieran at the helm, all on Zoom through COVID, through lockdown. And the curriculum is really structured to be bespoke and to work towards helping social entrepreneurs start and grow their businesses. And this is quite different to normal accelerators, which we'll dive into later. So if I could just ask a very quick introduction of each of the panelists, please. You have less than 60 seconds. So start with Caroline.
I knew it. I always get called first. Thanks so much, Kajal. I'm Caroline. Thanks to everyone who joined on to the discussion today. So for the ASAP Accelerator program, I was responsible for leading the operations and community aspect of the program. Before coming to LSE, I actually worked in Canada for 4 years in the energy sector, and I'm also at the same time doing my Master in Public Administration at the London School of Economics.
She's a master in multitasking. Go for it, Kieran.
Thank you. So I worked closely with Caroline as a co-program manager, and I worked on kind of more on the curriculum and student experience and alumni experience side on the program before having this role at ASAP's Accelerator. I worked with Entrepreneur First, which is a talent investor and deep technical fund vehicle. I also worked with a variety of universities, predominantly in the Northwest, and consulted a large amount of student accelerator programs and academic commercialization programs.
Thanks, Kieran. Alejandro.
Hi, my name's Alejandro. I was one of the co-founders of iSeek Mental Health that was part of this accelerator program and was receiving a lot of support from Caroline and Kieran as well throughout the process. I graduated from the University of Glasgow this year in the last summer. And yeah, we made the jump to go within the accelerator program to take some of the ideas that we had as graduating students and try and put them into practice. And I think later we'll get into what Aspect did to help try and make that reality.
Thanks, Alejandro. And just for the record, we haven't paid him to say all the good things that he will be saying. So we just want to get a quick poll of the audience to see who we have here. So Caroline, I think you've got a button you can press. Yeah, so you have a couple of seconds just to answer the poll. It's always fun to watch these numbers go up and down. It's quite exciting. Maybe I'm the only one that gets excited by this. Okay. Is this 60 seconds we have to do this? Okay.
It's just counting up, but most people have voted.
Okay, brilliant. So it looks like we have the top two categories: working with social scientists and I'm a social entrepreneur. So I have to ask this question, since there are so many people working with social scientists. How many social scientists does it take to screw in a light bulb? I wonder if anyone knows the answer to this. You can type it in the chat. Kieran one. The answer is actually they don't change the light bulb. They search for the root cause as to why the last one went out. Drum roll for that, please. Right. Let's kick off. So I wanted to just share just a macro stat on purpose-driven companies and why we think it's so important to support purpose-driven companies to start and grow through accelerator programs like Aspect. Purpose-driven companies witness higher market share gains and grow 3 times faster on average than their competitors, all while achieving higher workforce and customer satisfaction. So the profile of that person who starts this type of company is fundamentally different. And so the first question I want to ask to Caroline and Kieran, when we kicked off the program, what surprised you about the founders that were pitching relative to other accelerators? Kieran,
Caroline, would you like me to kick off? Yeah, sure. So I think the elephant in the room for me, just before I dive into the social side of things, was because of the timeline of when we operated, kicking off in the kind of August-September window. Loads of our founders who we were working with had been working entirely during COVID. And I think that's an amazing feat in general, but also just an interesting way that companies are being built in 2020, 2021, which is entirely virtually, with people that they spend very little, if not like at all time in face-to-face situations. And I think that environment like greatly shaped the way, in some ways I was kind of anticipating, and things I didn't really expect. That some of these pitches were so well polished and so well rehearsed, and the narratives and the commercial understanding and awareness of the founders was just unbelievable, bearing in mind that they had never even met their customers in a face-to-face situation, which is, for the founders that I had worked in, a real fundamental just belief that, as in the entrepreneurial ecosystems, you need to like live with your customers to understand them. And so that was a really, really key thing. Full disclosure, this was not my first like very social impact driven program. I had worked with socially minded and social entrepreneurial people before and founders, but in much more commercially heavy programs. And so I was really fascinated by the spectrum at which you could find entrepreneurs, from those driving charities with business models to all the other side of the spectrum, which was very commercially minded founders driving like commercial businesses, but secondarily or like tertiary effects of their company operating were driving social impact. And so that broad stroke spectrum was just something quite exciting. And knowing that anyone from any part of that kind of that dimension could be working with me for the next 4 months and figuring out how best we can add value into such a diverse cohort was really fascinating.
And Caroline, what struck you particularly when you were going through the pitching and evaluating? What struck you about the founder personality?
I think for me, similar to Kieran's second point, one of the things that struck me was the diversity of the founders, not just them as people, but also just the sheer diversity of the business ideas that were coming to the table on pitch days. And then even when you look at our final cohort of 19 teams, we have people tackling everything like Alejandro and his co-founder Ana. They're tackling mental health. We have people tackling, inequities in human waste processing and access to toilet facilities. We have other companies tackling childcare and access to childcare benefits. So the sorts of different business ideas that were coming out was something that really struck me on those first few days when we were doing the pitch selections. I would say the other thing that really struck me about this group of founders that we worked with was their passion and their commitment to the problem, not just to the solution that they were trying to create. We had during the cohort and during the program itself, quite a few companies who did pivot, who changed their business model, who changed their business idea. But at the end of the day, the reason why they were still doing this and what was still driving them forward was that they still had this commitment to the problem that they were trying to solve. And I don't think I've seen that before in other accelerators where there's much more of a commercial focus.
No, and I think just a point to add there, all of the people we had in our ecosystem, some of the mentors who are here today, one thing that they observed and really struck them was that purpose-led passion. So you can learn the business side, you can't necessarily teach and cultivate that passion for the problem. So that's something that all of the people involved have actually said. So Alejandro, you're one of those people. So what attracted you to apply to this accelerator?
So for me and my fellow co-founders as well, we didn't necessarily have a formal education of entrepreneurship while at university. I myself study psychology. So we had ideas for something that we wanted to create that, while aligned with the theory of psychology, to try and support mental health, we weren't sure if necessarily that was ready for something that could then be packaged and delivered to the market, so to speak. So for me personally, this was a program that provided a good structure to try and make that jump from I have an idea and I think I have a good understanding of the theory behind it to, okay, is it possible to deliver in the form of solving a problem to someone in a way in which it is sustainable and then also scalable from there.
And what, so we talk about commercial and socially driven, but really the most successful entrepreneurs are integrating those two very well from the start. So as you apply to Accelerator, what were your main business challenges that you wanted to solve as a social entrepreneur by coming onto this?
Yeah, absolutely. There were challenges that were both socially focused and also ones that were more focused on the business model. I think a big one for us was, I'll start one with the social and then I'll move on to a business example as well. On the social example, we knew that we could track the progress of how well we could do as we scaled if all went well, but we didn't know necessarily how exactly we would record that and how we would present that information to people. So we did have a session at one point during the program where we were informed how to keep metrics of the social good that you do and use those as key performance indicators as you would have economic metrics. And that was something which we wanted to know, how we could show. That aspect helped us with quite a lot. And then on the business side of things, one thing which we really needed help with was understanding whether our idea was ready to have product market fit, if it was actually going to solve the problem in a way in which users would pay for, so whether it could then from there be scaled upwards in a sustainable fashion. And for that, we learned that we needed to really solve a problem which wasn't being addressed in any other way. So that was something that we needed some support for, and Aspect did a good job of coaching us through the way to make sure that that we could guarantee that.
Okay, good job or great job?
good job and great job.
Great. So you touched on something really important there about measuring KPIs and impact. And again, that has to be integrated with the commercial KPIs. So one thing we want to talk about is how this accelerator was adapted in terms of the structure of the program and the curriculum for businesses like yours. So Caroline and Kieran, let's touch on the three main phases of the accelerator. How was this adapted? Kieran, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, sure. Speaking really broadly, we had the kind of initial phase, similar to how a startup is formed. We have our ideation stage where we kind of understand what's the product we're offering, how are we going to support founders in a unique and interesting way. We go out and find and recruit these amazing founders and their subsequently amazing businesses, and then we support with them through a really comprehensive support package, through mentorship, delivery modules, building a community, creating digital platforms and ecosystems for them to connect and collaborate, and then ramp that up into demo day, which is kind of the culminating phase, the demo day, the post-program support, and fostering that community to continue to live on past their time working with us in a really unscalable and a very one-to-one focused way. I would say, as we spoke about before the session, one of the key learnings or points of learning for myself was, having worked with a lot of different accelerators, both corporate innovation programs and in more academic spheres, I fell into the trap of building a very commercial first curriculum, or having ideas that were very commercial first, and then trying to sprinkle on social impact as an afterthought. And I realized very quickly after speaking to from speaking to people, listening to podcasts and reading blogs written by leaders in the space, both of social entrepreneurship theory and also social entrepreneurs themselves, you can't apply social as an afterthought. It needs to be really ingrained from the front. So I scrapped all of this unnecessary work I had been doing and tried to kind of go back from first principles, which was, if I was a social founder, what were the key things that I would want to be learning, and how would I want to be learning them? So from the delivery partners, everything from just referencing case studies that aligned more with me as a founder, with my business model, with the way I approach things, all the way up into very socially minded modules like theory of change, and as Alejandro was alluding to, impact measuring, stuff that the average commercial founder doesn't really think is priority or should be front and center. And by fostering that community at every phase and fostering that awareness at every phase, I feel like we were really able to tackle the dilemmas that early stage founders have in a very novel and interesting way, which was A, putting social first, but B, kind of getting people to speak to them in a way that's they're going to be receiving that in the most effective way, and subsequently able to apply that in a really effective way.
Yeah, and I guess, this is a comment or question to all of you. I mean, that's the narrative now. Can you really have entrepreneurs which don't think about this, just looking at maximizing shareholder profit and not thinking about the wider group of stakeholders? I mean, that's the, for the next 10 years, for foreseeable future, that's how businesses have to be built. So would you say this is really the blueprint of all future accelerators? Caroline?
Yeah, I would say that it's not just about the content, but even in the way that we operate and deliver the program is actually a blueprint for a lot of future accelerators, because we are now living in a time where before an accelerator like YC, you would go and move down to San Francisco and like get a house with your buddies who are your founders and then do the program together. But now we can't do that anymore. Like, we have to run it virtually. And I think this is actually a test of the fact that we could do that and still be able to build a community. So there's one aspect where I think that this is going to be a model for other accelerators to come. And then in terms of the content side, I think of course, we don't have like a perfect way to predict the future of like what is the best business model going forward. But I do think that now more and more consumers are wanting to be customers of companies that are thinking about something more than the bottom line, and they're making that active choice. So if a company comes into existence and doesn't think about that, that's also not a sustainable way to do business.
Yeah, and actually when we did a survey of the cohort, one of the biggest opportunities was that sentiment by customers who are willing to pay more for purpose-driven companies, where they understand the purpose, but also wanting to start their careers and join companies that have that mission central to them. Alejandro, maybe this is a good time for you to sort of jump in when you think about community. We talked about community a little bit, but you're in a cohort of completely diverse founders, and I know we really honed in on trying to make this cohort as diverse as possible. How did that impact you as a founder and your journey through this accelerator?
Yeah, definitely. As a founder within our team, IC Mental Health, we make a lot of mistakes, like every startup does. And it was really helpful to be connected within the cohort, within this community, with other founders who are going through the exact same process as we are. So we had a weekly series of what we called founder roundtables, where we would be put in a group with founders who were at similar stages of the development of their own businesses, that of course were socially driven, much like ours, and that allowed us to learn from them with what they're doing, what they're trying to strategize with, and how that can help us, as well as us sharing our stories with them. So I was really quite surprised actually that doing it all through Zoom was still enough to allow us to form these connections. But it was really helpful being to learn from one another in the community like that.
And Kieran, you know, one of the things I remember an early session we had right at the beginning of this journey, where you were really emphatic around D&I stats and had all sorts of spreadsheets and measurements of this. Can you talk about how that was different and how this was achieved through this accelerator?
Yeah, it kind of also goes back into one of your original comments or questions, Kajal, about what was different about the founders. And I've never worked with such a diverse cohort. I've always pushed this in all programs I've worked in, from corporate innovation to academic. But in our cohort, I was really pleased that we had 45 female founders accepted, women founders, and 45 BAME founders on our program. And not to mention founders with a diverse amount of disabilities and people from different socioeconomic age groups. It was really exciting, and I think that it was also exciting because subsequently with that diversity came a diversity of ideas that Caroline spoke about, people working on projects that I hadn't even considered because I was so far removed from that problem domain, from a geographical standpoint, from a relationship standpoint. It was something that I did focus really heavily on. I think I encouraged for a few different ways. On the recruitment side of things, it was about having diversity in our marketing materials, and it was about reviewing our comms and making sure that we were speaking to a larger group than those in the room. But then also when it came to, okay, we have this amazingly diverse cohort, how do we support them in diverse ways as well? And how do we support them with their diversity, putting that front and center, right? We appreciate that when we're on Zoom calls, like we're spoken to as human beings, but that we have huge amounts of diverse lived experiences that shape our views, our perspectives, and how we execute on things. And so it's kind of impossible to ignore that. And what we did subsequently was really focused on having diversity reflected from our cohort into the mentors we allocated, the mentors that we went and searched for, our delivery partners, making sure that was people from different countries, people from different languages, genders, races and backgrounds and ages who could speak to our cohort. And our cohort could subsequently be heard, which I think is a huge thing that's overlooked by many programs who optimize and kind of cover their eyes to the lack of diversity which the entrepreneurship field has in general. And subsequently, they overlook the microaggressions, they overlook the micro pressures that different types of founders receive. And so I think that's one thing that we put front and center in the way we designed and recruited for this cohort.
Yeah, and for those of you, I mean, on the topic of, it's not just about race and gender, but cognitive diversity. For those of you who want to read more about this, the book by Matthew Syed, Rebel Thinkers, which I'd really recommend, which talks about cognitive diversity, but also why that leads to better business results. So on the topic of female founders specifically, Caroline, can you talk to some of the things that ASAP did for female founders?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that. So one of the things that, and it's not just us that have realized this is actually the UK government had commissioned a couple of years ago the Alison Rose report on the state of entrepreneurship in the UK. And they found that only a third of entrepreneurs in the UK are women. And it's, you know, there's all sorts of barriers for women who are trying to enter entrepreneurship at every stage, you know, even from starting your business to once you get your business going, access to finance and having these barriers to accessing finance. And then other things that prevent a lot of women disproportionately from being able to scale their business. So, you know, things like disproportionate amounts of household responsibility is an example of one type of barrier that many women face as they reach a certain point of life and try to scale a business at the same time. So one of the goals of our program was to try and create a community where these women founders in our program could come together and share those concerns and share those experiences with each other. And I think quite consistently the feedback and sort of opinion that we got from the women founders who participated was that this was a forum where they thought, wow, we can actually share what we're going through and they were guided at one point. We had a discussion with another experienced founder as well, who had been through many of the same challenges in her own entrepreneurial journey, had raised funds, had actually worked on the other side in VC as well. And to be able to talk about that, I think was really valuable. So that was one of the main focuses of the program, was to try and create this community of women who know that they could be there to support each other. I think for next and future programs that we run, that will be one of our focuses, not just coming in maybe midway through the program, but from day one, when we start the program, to be able to open that dialogue and have that discussion right away.
Thanks, Caroline. And one thing which we probably should emphasize is this was multi-university. So every university has the very stereotypical sort of persona. So I can speak from the LSE side of the overachieving type A's. I wanted to touch on that with you, maybe, Alejandro, is what did that bring? Having 8 different universities in the mix, and Caroline, Kieran, feel free to comment there as well, versus just doing something with your own university by itself.
Yeah, it was great. There's a lot of diversity between universities, but also between the age groups of those universities as well, because the founders that were admitted onto the program, some were postgrads, some were graduating, some were in their first or second years of university. So there was a lot of diversity across the board. And having had the chance to do something with students from other universities, you could see how each university supported them with their own entrepreneurial projects, and each had different recommendations for competitions to enter in, or in different processes to try and get their ideas off the ground for. And as I mentioned before, with the Founders Roundtable, we had 3 different universities within our group while we were talking. So that it was nice that way to be able to synthesize the different support that we all had been able to get from our own universities, and to pitch those ideas to one another.
Thanks, Alejandro. Kieran, you can fly the Manchester flag here. What's your perspective on having multi-university founders?
I think it's really exciting. Historically, I've worked with a handful at a time, and then on larger programs I've worked with, when I work with like recent PhDs, it's really shown me the power of a network. And universities are sometimes can be quite insular, and that's difficult for outsiders to break in and leverage the full resource given. And so to have a platform where we were privileged to have 8 really prestigious institutions all backing us, gave us this platform to reach so many more people, and the network effects of those universities can really like play a part in that. But B, kind of following on from what Alejandro said, like universities have different edges, different specialisms, different departments where some things excel and others don't. The coincidence of you starting a company that has a need for a resource from an academic institution, which you coincidentally studied at and had a really specific resource allocation that aligns with your business model and your business venture, is really, really diminished. But joining a program like ours, when you can access, well, during the time of the program 8, but now closer to 16 in the broader aspect network of universities, and that's only growing, like that's a huge value proposition to have, and it can really open doors, both on an alumni scale, current access to academic scale, and also an access to talent just from all these graduating universities.
Thanks. And there's big ambitions to take this beyond the borders of the UK as well, nothing to do with Brexit, of course. So just as we have a lot of people in the audience who are working with social scientists, this was obviously the pilot program, there's lots to iterate on. How do you think we can improve to connect more social science researchers to this type of program? Caroline, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can start. I think that there's a couple things. If you're a university, this is how I was thinking about it. There's a couple things that could be done. I would say the first and most important one is that universities should really think about encouraging alternative, like entrepreneurship as an alternative and viable path for your career. So many university career centers, I mean, of course, the vast majority of your students are going to go into sort of 9-to-5 type jobs, but doing your own entrepreneurial thing, having your own company, is actually something that you can do after you graduate. And that's something that should be encouraged and could be encouraged more by universities. I, of course, understand that with COVID, it's sometimes hard to encourage people to take such a huge risk in their lives. But it's also something that is, lots of our founders are running their businesses on the side while having part-time jobs or full-time jobs. I don't think that this sort of creative spirit should be something that we don't encourage in a university setting. I think also from an institutional perspective, of course, this is super different for every university, but depending on where a student is, sometimes that sort of intellectual property policy or sort of who owns what of whatever research is going to be commercialized may be something that detracts or attracts students from pursuing entrepreneurial or further innovative activities at the university. Of course, that's like super case-by-case basis. And I think at the end of the day, what we did with this accelerator is to show that sort of programs like these that are a connection between the university and the business world are actually a great point and a safe space, I think, for people who are university community members to be able to incubate those ideas and then test the waters a little bit before they go out in the big wide world.
Yeah, I think we use the term flourishing internal ecosystem to connect business, industry, and academia. But just something I want to flip the narrative on a bit, which is entrepreneurship isn't actually risky. The point of accelerators is to de-risk the process, and there is a real discipline around it. If you think about lean startup technology and the way that you would translate research into a commercially viable venture. But really, all of the skills that you would learn on an accelerator, whether you run a venture, whether you join a job, are all transferable skills. And maybe Alejandro, you could talk about, you know, what were the most valuable parts of the program for you, and what are those skills that you think are transferable?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the thing that I most appreciated about the program was the linearity of each of the modules that we were following through. It served almost as a step-by-step checklist of what you need to make sure that you're doing if you are going to take your idea and then try and put it into the hands of the end user that you're trying to help with. So we started off with identifying the problem. We moved on to how to have conversations with users who are experiencing this problem and how to ask the right sort of questions to understand it. And then from there, we moved on to constructing a business model. From there, we moved on to looking at sales, and we basically moved along this continuum. To me, that was really helpful. All of them are skills which are also viable, not just for self-employed entrepreneurs, but also employed people who I guess are like intrapreneurs within their own businesses if employed in the workforce. And I just want to note as well that one thing that was becoming more clear to me as the program went on is that actually the process of like developing a social enterprise as an entrepreneur is very close to the research process that you do as well as a scientist. In my case, as I mentioned, I study psychology, and the process of asking a research question, building a methodology around it, testing it, coming up with some results and seeing where those results take you to ask more questions. It's a very innovative process in and of itself, and I think there are very strong parallels between that and the work that we did as part of the accelerator. So yeah, there are skills that are transferable, not just in the workplace, but for social scientists, period.
And what was the most if you were to single out one thing through the program that was the most valuable, apart from Kieran's stand-up comedy, what was the most valuable part for you as a for your personal development, but also for your business advancement?
I think it was the connection to mentors that they provided with us throughout the program, because a lot of us moving through university are very fresh. You know, we have course conveners and we have people that we met at university, but we haven't really been within the workforce, and we don't have those contacts or connections to help test ideas, to help put us into contact with people that we can collaborate with and accelerate that process. So Aspect were very supportive in doing what they could to try and put us into contact with people that we wanted to be in contact with. And I think for me, that was the biggest help that ICUC Mental Health that we got.
And a shout out to the mentors that have joined us today. You did an absolutely fantastic job to support our entrepreneurs. So big thank you. So in terms of impact then from a program execution perspective, Caroline and Kieran, can you highlight, and this is all within the report that we highlighted earlier, the impact report, can you highlight some of those top metrics from this accelerator in terms of impact for the founders, but also for the businesses? Kieran, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I have it on my other screen, so I'm just perusing as we go as well. Some of the things that jumped out to me beyond the kind of the key focuses of diversity and inclusion would stem around a kind of a key KPI that I always look at in my programs is Net Promoter Score, and understanding how helpful is the program that a founder would attribute it to that the program to have delivered said value, and so go on and like preach about how amazing it is and share it with other people. I find that recommendations is such a key part of that. Another part that Caroline and I focused a lot on was about as Alejandro alluded to as well, like founder X comes in, they maybe haven't worked in a large workforce, they haven't worked for many employers before, they haven't worked on many commercial projects before, they have quite a diminished network because of that. And how can we really inject as many interesting people into that journey as possible? And so just general business connections, but also more broadly their ability to connect outward of that. And some traits that I'm still struggling to quantify, but ones that we can kind of see actualize in front of us around general business professionalism, confidence, ability to time manage, and be kind of and be goal orientated. It's really hard to allocate like kind of a numerical value to these traits, although we are trying as social scientists. But I'm finding it really eye-opening to, and you can really watch the founders as they grow themselves in these traits, for instance.
So that's a call out to anyone in the audience actually who wants to help with that going forward and wants a research project. We'd love some support on how to measure and quantify that. Caroline, what about you on the impact side?
I think I echo a lot of what Kieran said, a lot of the founders' personal development, notice that as well. But for me, what really struck me is how some of the companies themselves actually grew so much over the 4 months that we were working with them. So Ali and Anna, your company, I saw you guys starting at a certain point in September, and then by the time we were ending in January, you had gotten out, 80 pilot kits across the UK, in London and Scotland as well, which was huge. Talking to, correct me on the number of customers, probably at least like 35 different customers and different organizations and universities, trying to reach out to them. And they're not the only ones. So we had 19 companies on the cohort. We had companies that sold their MVPs actually to municipal governments in Colombia and in Venezuela. We had a company who actually implemented a supply chain solution in 10 communities in India. We had a company that actually, started building a co-working space where people who will be able to work remotely, who are from the UK, be able to work remotely abroad now with COVID and people working abroad and digitally. So lots of actual business growth that came out of the 4 months as well. So that was one of the main takeaways for me, being able to see them actually apply the learnings from their time in the program to what they were doing in their business and be able to work on that.
Thanks, Caroline. And all of those metrics are in the impact report. So if I haven't shouted about that already, there's a link that you can go and have a look at that. Alejandro, on this point of, I know that you guys ended up shipping, 85 of your kits, and you had some really strong metrics there. But for you as a founder and your co-founder, can you comment on what Kieran said about earlier around confidence? Did going through something rigorous, you mentioned earlier about not having much business experience, can you comment on the confidence side of things?
Yeah, of course. I think it's a bit needless to say that of course we became very confident people moving through the program as we had a better mastery of the things that we knew that we had to do in order to make it reality. We're very far from having like any sort of total mastery at all, because it's a very long iterative process with these things. But it was good as well to work alongside others with that as well. I mentioned before that having other founding groups within that cohort, other social enterprises, was able to instill confidence in you to know that, oh, I can go out and do this because so-and-so in my group managed to win the pilot as well, and so-and-so managed to get a big interview with someone because they just cold called, and this is the script that they used, and that was also really helpful for us. So the confidence for me in my case personally doesn't just come from within, from the theory that we get taught and the practice that we get nudged to go out and do, but also in being able to be inspired by the fellow co-founders around you that are doing the same thing throughout the program.
Thanks, Alejandro. So I guess we want to leave some time for questions towards the end. So to wrap up, what we need is 3 of your top nuggets of wisdom for other universities who are looking at programs to support their social entrepreneurs or researchers. What should they take into consideration when they're building programs for social science and impact-driven companies to commercialize?
I would say something that I'm a huge advocate for is kind of instilling ambition from like day one, and you really want, if a researcher or an academic or a student or alumni is going to take that leap, you want them to shoot for the most ambitious version of what they can potentially achieve. And kind of following on from Caroline's point on like supporting academics and making this an accessible path, beyond that, it's about making sure that if they are going to take that leap, it's to make the biggest version of what they can, because that's going to generate the most impact. And if you don't succeed at that, hopefully you'll still have made a huge amount of impact along the way. But if you're cautious and you build bit by bit, tiny bit at a time, I feel like you increase your risk of failure and you decrease your potential impact.
Was that 3?
That was one wrapped in one.
Okay, we'll allow that. Caroline.
Sure. I would say my 3 points is, first, before we start like doing anything, I think a university needs to think quite carefully about what they actually mean by social entrepreneurship. Of course, we had a certain definition and a certain idea in our mind, but the more I look into it, the more there's like this differentiation between social enterprise, social service, and social advocacy. And I think that if you're a university entrepreneurship center, you really need to hone in on what you mean by social enterprise to be able to have a clear definition of what you want to support and what your vision for that is going to be going forward. I would say the second point is what I had already talked about before, which is in different ways encouraging entrepreneurship amongst your university, your student body, your faculty. So that could be even, having that as a career center path or a career center series of workshops. That's maybe supporting the entrepreneurship center at the university. Maybe that's having partnerships with the entrepreneurship center and researchers and research faculties or facilities at the university. There's different ways that a university can consider how they want to encourage that. And I think the third thing is, after the students leave university, there has to be some sort of support after you graduate. So I know within the Aspect Network, there is like varying levels of support at every institution. Some places have 2 years, some places have 5 years, some places have lifetime. But I actually think one of the most interesting things that came out of our cohort was we had a huge age and experience range, and that contributed a lot to the diversity of the cohort as a whole, to the maturity of the cohort as a whole, and being able to recognize that entrepreneurship can happen at any point in your journey. Your relationship with your university and your institution doesn't end on the day you get that piece of paper and you walk out the door, you've paid your last tuition installment, but it actually continues as you go forward and further into life, and being able to be that institution that has the resources to help encourage your graduates to explore other areas of their careers moving forward is something really valuable and really interesting. So I would say it's like pre, during, and post would be the 3 main things I'd highlight.
Thanks, Caroline. And just to echo that culture of entrepreneurship, we did about 14 interviews with early stage and later stage entrepreneurs, and the genesis of a lot of those businesses were that culture of openness to entrepreneurship and to take your research and to turn it into a business idea. So however that's cultivated, the infrastructure around that was one of the key determinants to a number of our businesses in this cohort actually deciding to go down the startup route and potentially, making a huge impact as they grow. Any final comment from you, Alejandro, on that from a university perspective?
Yeah, of course. Would you also like me to list my 3?
Go for it. Okay,
cool. The first one is that I think it would be super helpful if universities placed larger emphasis on a need to innovate or to encourage students to innovate. As I mentioned, it's a key part not just of academia within the research process, but also in going out there and creating new things that the world needs, whether that be in form of entrepreneurship or within a company that you're being employed by. And universities have a lot of intellectual firepower to make that happen. You know, I miss now having graduated, not having the library or the office hours, or, you know, and the seminars available, which can really help support that. So I think they both go hand in hand. Also, that a lot of the skills which one would develop on a program like this, or going through an entrepreneurial journey, are very you know, transferable to other parts, not just of professional life, but life in general. You know, I think making you a more confident person also helps in relationship building. You know, better understanding the problem that you're trying to solve for users also improves people skills. And yeah, the final is something that Carolyn mentioned earlier as well, that universities place a big emphasis on employability in general, and not necessarily going into entrepreneurship as a means of doing that. I know, for example, in my course, the modules were designed to put a big emphasis on what skills you're getting out from these modules that are also then helpful in the workplace in the form of employable skills. There's no real mention of self-employable skills as well. I don't know how we would build a framework for that and you know, present that to students when they're actually doing their courses, but something to think about, because the employable skills and the self-employable skills are kind of synonymous.
Well, that was a great advert for the next accelerator, but I think that those self-employable skills are absolutely crucial, and I think a lot more funding is going into that across Europe as well. So thanks for mentioning that point. I actually carried on with questions to the panel, because we did ask for questions in the chat, but people are being very shy and not asking. So if anyone has questions, you can switch on your screen and shout out, or you can please type it into the chat before we go on the break, and we'll answer one or two.
I have a few questions I'd love to ask.
Go for it.
A couple questions just on running an accelerator. So I was curious, you talked about it a bit in the beginning, but obviously COVID-19 was surprising, and the transition to being an online accelerator happened quite quickly. So I'm curious as to what you feel the transition was like and what you would do differently, especially given that in the upcoming months, it's fair to assume a good chunk will remain online. So if there were any things about the transition you could do again, what would you do differently, and how do you think you'd be able to support, especially underrepresented groups, even better?
I think Caroline ran a program just before this, at the precipice of COVID-19's first lockdown back last year. So I think she has a better opinion. To be like, my opinion now is anyone running an accelerator has no excuse to not make an amazingly seamless virtual experience, like us, humble brag, because like we have had so much time to prepare, and like the majority of founders are digital natives. So they're very ready and excited to adapt to new stuff, whether you're running stuff on Slack or Hopin, whether you're running Clubhouse sessions or something more interactive and engaging and cutting edge. Like your entrepreneurs are the ones who are often the first adopters to that. And so people are really receptive. I think, Caroline, I'll leave it to you to answer some more thorough stuff on how to jump in as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a conversation with you, Celine, depending on what your needs are after this as well. I would say that, well, first of all, actually for this ASAP accelerator, we didn't have to pivot from in-person to online. The program started at the end of September, so we knew that it would only be online. We had some maybe like glimmers of hope that we would end with some in-person event, but that was completely dashed. But we knew we would start from online from the beginning. So I would say there are three sort of main categories of things to think about. The first one is picking the right tools. The second one is having good and constant communication. And the third one is thinking about the structure of your program and having a very clear vision of that before you start. So in terms of tools, we of course use Slack to be able to communicate with the cohort amongst themselves. Minimal email, and then we also used a lot of Google Drive within the team who was working on the accelerator, and then we used a platform called Notion to be able to put all the material from the accelerator sessions and stuff like that and share that with the cohort. I think that worked. Of course, there's other tools out there. It's all a matter of like what's appropriate for the group, the size, like, you know, size, demographics, what your budget point is as well. The second point I would say is around communication, especially because it's virtual. You just need to make sure that like everyone knows exactly where to be when, what they're doing this day, that day, things like that, and being able to have a regular communication and clear and open communication with your group. And the third point I'd say is on structure. So the first thing that Kieran and I did when we sat around the table together in July and August was we thought, how are the next 6 months going to look? What are we going to do when? What are the pillars of our curriculum? What are the pillars of our program? And having that sort of vision in mind, but at the same time, not boxing yourself into that vision, right? So there were a couple of things that we had ideas about and we tried to start them and we put them out and it didn't work. So we just like, okay, we're gonna regroup, do it again. So having that, but then also the flexibility to move. I would say if we had to do it differently, it really also, I'm sure that any other future cohort we run will be run differently because it will be with a different group of people who have different needs and different businesses. So we'll just have to adapt to what those needs are. But I think the three pillars, like tools, good communication, and structure, are key at the end of the day.
You also spoke about like supporting diverse communities, and like there is nothing more equalizing in this world than everyone being stuck at home. Short of buying people laptops who potentially couldn't afford like laptops that could process or better mobile phones to engage with our activities. And we knew that everyone who joined our program did have enough technological A capabilities, but B like support to execute on the tools and platforms we were using. Everyone, whether you had kids and you needed to be home for 5 and we ran our sessions at 5 and you could also cook dinner and listen in, whether you have a disability that meant you were less mobile or less able to access things, we were able to share slides ahead of time or in time. You would have access to dictation software if you were visually impaired. You could get extra time with us, myself and Caroline, without us having to move into another meeting room or reschedule things at a moment's notice. And that was something that I've seen across all of the programs that I'm running and working with. It's become more accessible than ever to take that leap of faith and join a program like this that seems at a service level really intensive, but actually we structure the program in a way that really makes it as accessible as possible.
And Celine, I guess just a final comment on that. This accelerator, that's the last one, there were two program leads, so Caroline and Kieran, and who have very complementary personalities. And when you're online, 4 hours, you can imagine eye strain and everything else. It's that fatigue really sets in. So having two people really helped that dynamic, and also just switching up your formats. So making sure you have guest speakers, different types of learning, case studies, that makes a huge difference to people paying attention to the end. Thanks for that question. The Ant and Dec of the accelerator. I wasn't going to pitch you two as Ant and Dec, but we'll go with that, Kieran. Any other changes? We'll take one more, and then we're going to have to go for our loo breaks before we have Sharath on. Any other changes you would make to the program content based on learnings? Luke, we are going to talk about that in the second half around social business model innovation and some learnings from there. But any quick comments from the panelists on that one? No, okay, we'll cover that in the second half. Well, now everyone stop being shy and we've got questions rolling in. So where do you see ventures heading for support at the end of the accelerator? Quick one on that before we go.
Cool. Yeah, so there are a variety of kind of there are a growing variety of venture vehicles that also support by having social impact, or social venture vehicles that also have like associated programs, venture studios, or independent kind of accelerators. I think a large amount of our startups are actually in a position where they could potentially really start transacting business and becoming cash flow positive and optimizing for that journey. We did provide most of the founders with a small investor network, if not like handheld them in those early investor introductions. So if they would like to take on capital, we think they have the assets to do that now. But I would really nurture all of them to take real stock and reflect after the last intense 3-4 months of working with us, and encourage them to say, what's the right next step for me? Do I need further, more intense support? Do I need venture or some other type of capital, or is it my time to really just knuckle down and work with my customer? I think we're just in such a topsy-turvy world right now that it's difficult to do that reflection with any certainty of what the next 2-3 months looks like moving forward. And so that's really dictating. I think a lot of the founders are just in a bit of let's wait and see what happens to opening up and engaging with new customers and engaging with new stakeholders for the next 6 months.
Thanks, Kieran. And Steve, Sharath, who's joining next, is actually doing some post-program coaching for some of those founders who've accelerated from the program. So he'll touch on some of that. Right, I want to make sure you can have your coffee or vodka or whatever else you drink on at 4:50 on a Tuesday. We shall be back at 5 o'clock. We'll introduce Sharath and some of the learnings we have on social business model innovation. So see you shortly. Thanks, everyone. Okay, welcome back, everyone. After that very quick break, really pleased to have with us today Sharath Jeevan. He is an award-winning social entrepreneur and is the founder and former CEO of STIR Education, which partners with governments to ignite and sustain teacher intrinsic motivation. STIR has improved lifelong learning for more than 200,000 schools and 35,000 teachers in India and Uganda. Sharath also kicked off the ASAP accelerator with our cohort and is currently conducting post-program coaching for several of our leading founders from the program. So welcome, Sharath. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Kajal. Thanks. It was so much fun to hear the panel before as well.
Yeah, they were fantastic. And we have a recording of this as well for people who want access afterwards. So I just want to set the scene here a little bit. Sharath was part of a study we were doing around social business model innovation. And we did a series of about 14 interviews to really try to understand how social startups, both at the early and later stages, evolve their business models differently to if you were just thinking about for-profit. And we also wanted to understand some of those unique challenges and opportunities they face with a view to really honing in on specific interventions for future accelerators for social science entrepreneurs. So some of the challenges and opportunities that came across when we did the survey, the first set of challenges, the most frequently mentioned one was, how do I find an effective go-to-market? Which customers and channels do I target first and in what phase? The second, balancing long-term impact with short-term business. A lot of people talked about this profit and purpose tension, and we'll talk about why we think that can actually be converted to a flywheel effect. And then something Alejandro mentioned on the panel, which was, how do we measure and communicate that impact to a wider group of stakeholders? And then, of course, some of the opportunities when we're thinking about purpose and impact-driven businesses is recruiting high-quality, mission-driven talent. Millennials want to work for companies that have a core mission. And also the growth in the number of impact investors over the last 5 years. We had a few who joined the ASAP Accelerator program to come in for fireside chats, etc. So how do we target them? And the other opportunity is just attracting more diverse stakeholders. So in the context of those challenges and opportunities, as we went through the interviews, 3 major ideas and best practices emerged, and you can find this all in the report if someone could just post the link in the chat. So the first was building a data-driven translation engine, and what that means is all of the social science research you may have done, all of the customer insights, and any other external world insights, how do you ingest that and translate that into commercially viable or impact-driven products and services. The second one is channel scaling. So Sharath and I will talk about that in a second, but it really speaks to that challenge of an efficient go-to-market. How do I make the most impact in the shortest amount of time, and who do I need to target to do that? And are there some heuristics and shortcuts around that process? And the third is finding, the traditional term is product market fit, but how do you find purpose product market fit so you can resolve those profit purpose tensions early on and really lead with purpose and embed that throughout the business? So I think we wanted to explore this through the lens of Sharath's entrepreneurial journey with STIR Education, and it's one of the case studies in the report. So maybe Sharath, you can just give a few minutes on your entrepreneurial journey with STIR in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks, Kajal. So the question we ended up solving, or was trying to solve for, not when we started off, was really around teachers in developing and emerging countries. So take India as an example. The government had built 1 million free to access government schools. 240 million children were in the school system. So all the hardware, if you like, was funded and was free to access, but the software wasn't really working. Teachers were not motivated. There'd been a long tradition of teaching in India, but this had become a sort of civil servant job. Teachers weren't showing up always. When they were in school, they weren't fully full-hearted in that much of the work they were doing. And we wondered, no one seemed to want to address that problem. It seemed like a classic wicked problem. There was no easy sort of product solution for it. And we were perhaps crazy enough to think, could we solve that? I'm not sure we fully solved it, but by the time I'd been there for 9 years and founded it, the organization reached about 35,000 schools, as you mentioned, and we about 6 million children. We're hoping to get to about 60 million children in the next iteration. And I've handed over to a fantastic CEO who's was the former CEO of ActionAid, who will take us in this next chapter. But tons of learning, I think. And what I thought I was going to learn was not what I ended up learning. That was the fun of it, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, and it's a great story. And one of the things you said was social science problems are messy. They're not easy to codify. So can you talk about how did you actually take that problem and as our early stage entrepreneurs talked about, find that efficient go-to-market, because you could have gone singularly to each school, but you found a different approach.
Yeah, so in the first year of STIR, as you said, Claudia, we went school to school. We literally worked on about 12 schools in our first year. And I think the question is, how do you go from 12 schools in year 1 to, in our case, 35,000 schools in year 9? And it definitely wasn't a linear growth path. And I think this idea that we were talking about when we chatted about this with Karen as well, that idea that scale is not impact in the social sector. Impact investing, I fully agree, it is an emerging sector. Hopefully more and more of our sort of investment in the world will go towards this. But right now, finding really aligned impact investors is not the easiest thing. That they are harder to find. And so one of the questions I think we were asking ourselves was, how do you scale our impact without scaling our organization? And so for us, what we realized was that we had a core, we had an idea, we had the methodology really, but someone else had to be the implementer or the deliverer of that methodology. And for us, it was thinking, who in an education system, we're working in government or public systems, so we had to think about that as the sort of map of where to find that, this idea of a kind of jiu-jitsu point. Where in the system was there a point of leverage where we could embed our methodology in? Was there an existing resource, an existing role, and almost convert that person or role into being a carrier of our methodology? And that became really the whole focus. How can you find that person? How do you understand their roles, their constraints? And how do you sort of motivate and align and train and support them to be your deliverer? While we remain about 80, 90 staff, 35,000 schools. We had to think in that kind of way.
And how, if you were to advise early stage entrepreneurs, because they're all struggling with this, right? And, I'm a big advocate of, don't do single client acquisition or single customer acquisition. So how would you advise early stage entrepreneurs who are going through this process of who to target? What are those secret sauce in terms of getting this more of this efficiency early on?
Yeah, so I think one theme is really understanding the problem, and something I've been doing with the amazing aspect entrepreneurs in both our group session and also our individual coaches is just going back to that problem and the landscape around the problem. So who are the actors in the space around you in the ecosystem? So just talking, in fact, Alejandro and I were just having our coaching sessions before the panel, and we were talking about the role of counselors in universities, for example, for mental health. So how do we understand what the life of a counselor looks like in that example? If we think, how do we try and design something that really meets their needs, but actually, where possible, co-designs that with them so they feel part of the solution as well? So I think it's just really getting out. It's very different from the kind of Silicon Valley type approach to entrepreneurship, where that is very much impact equals scale. There's a clear path. You get seed, VC, IPO or exit, whatever those things are. But then the company, Google's got tens of thousands of employees now, or any of the tech companies. I don't think we're there in most cases in the social sector, right? There may be some exceptions, but I think the positive or silver lining from that is that I think many of the entrepreneurs I've certainly met in Aspect who are amazing. They are social scientists at the core, right? They love the problem. They love the research side of this. They love they have deep, purpose, as you were saying, to that problem. There's a great way for them to really focus on that, which is the exciting part. It's the R&D. It's to be the R&D factory. Other people can scale it. You've got governments, you've got the market, you've got other kinds of mechanisms to do that. And it's just realizing what is the role I want to play as a founder versus what will the ecosystem around me do and help me scale my model. But it allows you to have, perhaps leaner teams, more fun and more engaging and more iterative and learning cultures internally, dynamic entrepreneurial cultures, not becoming bureaucracies. There's a number of, I think, good things for entrepreneurs in that story.
And I'm just thinking sort of out loud, as you're talking about tools. So we looked at, when we were doing this study, we looked at the social business model canvas. We looked at, traditional methods of stakeholder mapping. Are there any tools that you'd recommend that people could use to get there faster, to get to the answer faster?
Yeah, I think one of the things actually that the faster point is one I think where I think we were also under pressure. It was funny. I've been talking to a number of great entrepreneurs about this topic, but there's always pressure. Everyone wants things to happen tomorrow. It's good. Yesterday even, yeah. Well, even faster, because yeah. So, and of course that's good. We want that hustle. We're all entrepreneurs. That's important. But I think constantly going back every 6 months to the problem and saying, look, are we really attacking the core of the problem, the purpose that you talked about? Is that really what we're trying to do here, or have we got off track is really important. And I think that ability to say, okay, we'll take this part of the problem now, we'll learn quickly, we'll iterate, we'll try some experiments and keep building an end-to-end solution for the problem we're trying to solve. That's the kind of culture I think that can be really powerful in these very messy or wicked problems, as you described. These aren't straightforward technical issues we're normally dealing with. These are pretty complex human problems we're grappling with here.
And that's really interesting, because you talked about it, non-linearity of this process, and Alejandro also talked about parallels between the entrepreneurial journey and the research journey. So really adopting that lean startup methodology, going out test, but being really reflective and coming back to base on are you still solving the problem for the target customer? Is there any reading you've done around this that you found helpful on your journey?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out myself, Kajal, in September, and I've been talking to lots of people about purpose. And you mentioned this, the introduction. And one of the things I found really that was a theme, whether you're talking to an environmentalist or an entrepreneur or president or whoever it is, purpose ultimately in our careers and in our ventures is about helping and serving others. That was the core piece, that idea of helping and serving others as purpose. And so what's nice with that social science sort of researcher sort of mindset, researchers are inherently curious about problems, right? That's how they become researchers, and they get fascinated by the problem. I think we can encourage more and more of that. And so I think often when I've talked to many of the great entrepreneurs on Aspect, there's this sort of pressure to become Elon Musk or any of these sort of Silicon West Coast stereotypes and all this nonsense, but actually keeping that researcher mindset and really deeply identifying with the problem, going deeper and deeper, becoming an expert in that. That will make your purpose really clear and really stand out. But also you'll be much more relaxed because your solution is going to change as you go. And for Stir, it changed at least 4, maybe 5 times over the 9 years. But what kept us anchored and focused was that the alignment with that problem and knowing that we were solving the problem better and better. But you never get to perfection in this, right? It's always about one more iteration, one more learning. But that, I think, will keep and sustain entrepreneurs much more on the path with that sense of purpose and that focus on the problem.
That's actually a really refreshing perspective and maybe a relief to some researchers, because I always hear this narrative that research and academic is the antithesis to the entrepreneurial way. So what you're describing is a way to really embrace the strengths of research and inculcate that into the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, I actually think, one of the things I've learned from engaging so deeply with Aspect over these past months, it's been a real pleasure and an honor. But I think I'm more and more convinced that when I talk, I also coach a number of what do you call it, sort of traditional Silicon Valley entrepreneur types with traditional VCs. I'm actually telling them they need to adopt more of a researcher mindset to their work, because I think the stereotype of, there's a fixed path, the goal is to jump through these hoops. And if you go to the Valley and you're hanging out in a bar in San Francisco or Mountain View or Palo Alto, it's become a bit of a game, right? Like you sort of, okay, if how much was your pre-money funding, how much was your pre-money valuation? Okay, that means go to Sequoia next. And we've lost the identification of problem. It's almost become a machine serving the machine itself. And I think that researcher mindset has a lot more innocence. It's a lot more fun. It's a lot more engaging. It's a lot more purpose-driven, as you said. I think that can actually help, I think, conventional entrepreneurship, to use these words, find its purpose a bit more, actually. So I think there's a lot we can take from research back to the, all this sort of the startup guru world as well.
Yeah, and I sort of take that and then put it back into the context of the conversation we had around that translation engine, right? So it's you have the researcher mindset and you've got so much information from both from customers and who you're delivering to, but also from secondary research from the outside world. And you talked about a really interesting way in STIR called the program design function around how you took that in and translated that. So can you talk about what you did there and that program design function, the skills around building that and making that effective?
Yeah, so I think, as entrepreneurs or founders, we're incredibly passionate, but it's very hard to, there's a famous Korean saying that, a great barber should not cut his own hair. And I think there's another of that, we get very obsessed by our problems. It's hard to see the wood from the tree sometimes. And we start using our own language and sort of describing things in very unique, and which is great. It's all part of the journey. But sometimes we just need someone to keep us an honest broker. So what we would do at STIR is we would have advisory groups, keep people we trusted out there in the ecosystem. We'd constantly be talking to them about what we're learning and saying, translate this for us. What does this mean in the external world? What language do you use? How do you make this more relevant to the issues that the sector as a whole is thinking about? And I think that became a really important function to both share our learning to the outside world, but also listen to the outside world and say, what learning are they bringing, or what's coming outside that we need to bring inside? Otherwise, I think you can become very insular as a founder of an organization.
And how did you do that with agility? So, some of these things are happening so fast, and then you've got to put that into your programs and design something relevant. Can you comment on the speed on which you were able to achieve this?
Yes, I think, just some examples in the coaching sessions I've been doing with some of the amazing aspect founders is that I think we sometimes feel pressure to sort of have the perfect solution, right? We want this sort of all singing, all dancing product that solves everything, that will be, above any reproach in terms of it meets every possible need and keeps everyone happy. Those products rarely exist, as we know, in any sector. What I found is a better way sometimes to do this is to be really open, so let's co-create this together. We know that we can't, version 1 of the MVP of the product won't be able to do every possible bit, but there's a commitment from us as the founders that we'll make sure that version 2 or 3 does do that. But I think a lot of this is about building the trust with the ecosystem and the people who ultimately will scale your work or scale your product or process. How do you get them on board so that they're part of this? They're not just a sort of a bystander scaling it passively. They're creating it with you. And that means all the wrinkles, all the issues that are going to come up, which they will come up, they'll be much more patient as you go through those and sort of actually solve for them together with you, and be an almost extended intelligence outside your organization, but it's still very much part of your scaling ecosystem and part of the scale.
And you talked about this, in STIR, doing that with government. So really transferring that capability. So ultimately they weren't dependent on you. But how do you, as an early stage entrepreneur, you don't have the credibility yet. How do you actually create that buy-in and incentivize people to co-create with you?
Yeah, and that's, again, I think one of the big advantages of the wonderful sort of the profiles of the founders we have here is that they are purpose-driven founders. They are social scientists or social. They've got that sort of deep integrity in terms of research and the problem. I think governments, or in that example, will trust you, and so will a market or a regulator or whoever you're trying to scale with. I think if they know that you're genuinely trying to address the broader problem, you're not trying to push or peddle one solution that takes your fancy, they're much more likely to trust and build into a long-term relationship. So still our version, MVP 1, 2, 3, we're pretty, honestly at times, pretty substandard. But people were very patient with us as they worked with us, and they helped us get to version 2, 3, and 4. So it's just a culture of trust and openness, but also the ability to say, look, this is, that we are building this together. I don't have all the answers up front. Why don't we try and really build that very, very deep partnership around scaling?
And do you think that there is a difference there with social entrepreneurs? And you mentioned Silicon Valley, you've touched on coaching both. Do you find that there's more openness with the less conventional entrepreneur, the non-Silicon Valley entrepreneur, to be that vulnerable and to say, look, I don't know the answer yet. We are going to develop this with you. Are there any differences?
So it's really funny. I was listening this morning to a podcast about the late Bill Campbell, as one of the Silicon Valley's sort of most legendary coaches, and he coached Steve Jobs, a number of the Google, I think Eric Schmidt at Google, and so on. Actually, if you look at the really great entrepreneurs in say Silicon Valley, I think they follow many of these principles. Actually, they are actually remarkably humble about. There's a bravado in front of a camera and so on, but actually very deep, very reflective, always thinking about the problem. What's happened is, I think, because obviously that VC game has exploded, there's a lot of entrepreneurs who've sort of jumped into this and jumped on the bandwagon, and I wanted VCs as well who followed the quickest path, which is the kind of the template-based approach to this. But I think even actually exceptionally in the Valley, the really great companies are really driven by that problem. And if you look at Google, what it's done as an example, had so many iterations, right? It's moved so much over the years. So yeah, no, I think it actually there's common themes, but I think that our storytelling around entrepreneurship needs to change a bit to reflect that.
And presumably that's in the book that you are about to release, but it's a good segue. You talked about purpose. So one of the things that we found from these interviews was around finding that purpose product market fit. And we found that the entrepreneurs who really led with that purpose, so that messaging was very, very clear, very simple, both internally and externally. Can you talk about some of the ways in which that alignment can happen earlier on in the journey, and tools and methods around that?
Yes, I think a lot of it is trying to, I talk a lot about the idea of the cost of inaction. So what often happens for many of the, I know Alejandro's on the panel, is about mental health, that many of the costs of mental health we don't actually ever put on any kind of calculus. It's not on our GDP accounts, it's not on a university's balance sheet, for example, but it's really significant. So first thing we learned at STIR was that governments were spending about 90% of their education budgets on teacher salaries, and yet much of that 90% was just being wasted, right? And that was actually, in India, I think it was about $25 billion a year, if you look at the waste. So it's just that idea of sort of putting that number around it, helping frame that, but really with the purpose piece over there. And I think what's happening is problems that are genuine ones that society needs to bear. I think many people now are much more aware of them, as you were saying earlier on the panel. More people are willing to attack those, but they need to it needs to feel real for them. So, motivation didn't feel real, but $25 billion does feel real. So how do you create that flywheel, as you said, and try to put numbers on the cost of that so it really galvanizes people and creates that's burning platform for change?
I mean, that in part comes from really knowing your stakeholders deeply and understanding their motivations and drivers. It's a really good point. I mean, and you talked about, not having a template. We did look at theory of change, as a way to really understand that. Is that something that you would recommend looking at, for those who are starting now, in terms of integrating that into their process?
Yeah, so I think it's okay. I think increasingly I'm thinking about this idea of a theory of problems. So by that I mean really going deep into what is that before we jump to solution. The theory of change is great, but what happens is we immediately jumping into solution mode.
Mm-hmm.
I think that idea of actually mapping out a problem. What is really this problem look like? What are the causes? It's a bit like a social science, the light bulb joke, but there are these really deep root causes in all these things. Can we put them in one place? We at least understand them. It doesn't mean we need to touch or address every single one, but we're explicit about what we are addressing, what we aren't. A lot of the problems in social sciences happen when we kid ourselves about what we can address and what we aren't trying to address. So not kid ourselves, but aren't fully honest with ourselves about that. So I think that really, really clear articulation of what does this problem look like? How do I put my proverbial arms around it? That can really help then figure out, okay, is this approach or intervention or model, what aspects of the problem is it solving and what isn't it? And that really helps us improve over time.
Thanks for that. And I think that really ties up with that, the entrepreneurial journey being non-linear and really always even looping back. So even if you've done the theory of problems at the outset, you're looping back to that throughout the journey and making sure that the solutions link to that.
Yeah, I think just the thing that's really interesting, like I'm just actually some of the entrepreneurs I'm mentoring in the sort of Silicon Valleys of the world, they're on the third or fourth career leg, right? And they might have addressed the problem in different ways. They might have been a VC in one incarnation or leg. Now they're an entrepreneur. They might go off and work at a Google, for example, right? Be an entrepreneur, as Alejandro was saying. So I think what's exciting with this idea of really falling in love with a problem, and I think you guys, I know, focus on this a lot in aspect, but it means that we're more flexible. So whatever happens to our individual venture, we're developing a knowledge of a problem that is going to be so useful for ourselves in our careers, but also for society at large as we move into different roles. So it's not a sort of one-stop game. It's also about how can we create careers that are really anchored around that deep understanding of the problem.
That's probably a whole nother webinar in itself. So we'll probably have to stop there because I'm just conscious of time. So thank you so much for joining us. And just to let everybody in the audience know, we did share this yesterday, but some of those findings and case studies are in the Social Business Model Innovation Report. We still have some work to do. These are very preliminary findings, but speaking to people like Sharath, through a 7-year journey, has really provided some strong insights into how we can better support early stage social entrepreneurs in future accelerators and programs. So thanks for joining, and also a thank you to our panelists, Caroline, Kieran and Alejandro, for being with us. I know people had more questions, so if you do, just we'll send you a follow-up after this session with the recording, and if you have any further questions, you have the contact names in that email as well, so just feel free to send us a note. In the meantime, do tweet us, follow us across the 3 channels. And in terms of what next for Aspect, this was, as I mentioned earlier, a pilot program. We're very much looking towards learning from the community as well, and as Sharath described, really co-creating this to make it relevant and effective for early stage social entrepreneurs. So please do engage with us. We would like to do more and make this bigger, not just in the UK, but across Europe. So do get in touch if you have anything you want to share or comments or feedback on this session. Great. Does anyone have any final questions before we jump off? Nope. You can type it in the chat or shout out. Otherwise, we are actually on the dot at 5:30. Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and we will follow up with an email after the session.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Kajal.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Sharon.
everyone. Bye, guys.